Hi, once again, and welcome to the Wise Fish Chess Academy. Today, we have another interesting video. This time, the theme has changed, and we're looking at a rook ending, which came from a game between two engines, or two bots, in this case, lichess bots. One that called themselves Revenge Bot now, and that is called Soprano. And this is very interesting because you can see that white is a pawn bishop versus knight endgame, but of course white is a pawn up. So that means he has the chances to win. There's no way that black has anything here except to fight for a draw. I like this game because it is very, very instructive. A movement you naturally might not think of as a human. I probably would be thinking about moves like to get the retreat the knight back to C, um, to E5 and so on, and get the king closer as much as you can to kind of like guide this pawn to F8. However, a very interesting move was played, and this is pure calculation, but it makes sense when you see the explanation of the logic behind it. So here, the rook to C7 was played, pinning the bishop to the king, and also putting himself in a pin. Now, this is an engine. It is an engine. We expect that it's going to play quite amazing stuff. This one it played. Now, it's weird at first, but when you think about it, this king cannot actually move. He's in Zug's one. If he moves to H8, to A8, then he gets knight discovered check, and then the rook is falling. On the other hand, he manages to somehow play a4 and then he's able to move the king to a6, still knight to b8, check, and the same thing happens. The rook is being set. So as the rook being on the seventh rank is quite risky. Probably needs to get away from there. But for now, there is a pin. So you can probably just hang around it and maintain that pin there as long as the king doesn't move. So because the full position is trumped and played for black, white has this very interesting hold. Oh, he has a weakness on f4. And that's what black tries to exploit. Now, white just ignores it. Now, if you take this, it's obvious what's going to happen. Knight will just come, will win a piece, and you lost simply. So he cannot take it. So you have a very interesting move to f5 turns, and that's when the knight still anyway comes back. King goes to h7 to a8, sorry. Then rook takes, king takes. Now, this should be winning for white. But you have to be really careful and understand endgames. Otherwise, this can so easily be drawn. So the idea is simple. You want to cut off the king as much as you can, and you want your rook to be in front of your pawn when doing that. It's typical of rook endings. Same happens. So check, rook defends, rook attacks back. Which pawn do you save? If you save the A pawn, is meaningless when they take the pawn on previously on F5, the rook will go back to H8, and there's no way you're going to kick the king away from the A8, and that would simply be a draw. So you have to be really careful. So he chooses to give up the A4 pawn, so takes x, and the king goes to B5, and then rook retreats back to the aggressive square F4, attacking the pawn. Now here it's very easy for you to want to push that pawn forward, but once you do that, the game is simply drawn, as there's no way you can progress with your king forward, because simple moves like rook at f5 check, and then you can go down, and there's no way to make any progress here anymore, and that will simply be a draw. But you can analyze that further on your own. So here what happened is that rook goes to uh, uh, f6, which is actually the only move that wins the game, and king has to come closer. Again, it's easy for you to look at the move rook f7 as a juicy move, but it actually simply draws the game. If you play it, then king goes to c8, and you bring king to c5. There's really not so much you're going to do because the king is going to get behind the pawn. In front of the pawn, still him and kick away the rook, and that will be drawn. So you have to be really careful. So what happens here is quite instructional. The rook goes to f6, and when the king moves forward, king without wasting a move, king goes straight for the e5 square. And after that, If your king goes to, let's say, king goes to e7, then rook take, and when you move away, then you lose a rook on the f4 square. So that was not played. So when the king moves here, the rook has to, retreat, and then the brilliant move rook to e6, which cuts off the king completely. Now you can see the king is just going to march over to the to the king, sorry, and then it will be difficult for black to stop him. So the rook will just cut off, let's say, along the e file, and then this pawn will be guided home, become a queen, and that should be winning for white. So what happened there is after the rook went um, to support the king, rook goes to h4. Of course, with the idea of rook f6. After the check, you simply go down. Now, still, the rook is cutting off the king. There's no way you can exchange it at this moment. So you have to retreat the check, king attacks the rook. And when you go back, then the rook is now free to maintain uh, the e5 cutoff from the king. And this is just simple principle. You expect that the king will now move to the e5 in front of the king and guide the pawn home. So rook check, this is what happens. Rook goes back, pawn goes f6, rook gets back to f3, rook check, king goes h8, and the same pattern happens. And down here, it's just routine end-up understanding. And when the rook goes to g7, there is simply no way to save it, as the king will move to g8, and then the pawn promotes to a king on f8. So I think that this is an instructional video, and it shows two engines playing. Of course, the accuracy level is very high. What's most important is the lesson that we have got in rook ending, rook pawn ending. So thank you again for tuning in to the show. See you next time. Have a good day. Bye bye.